that, let's go ahead and get started. Um, so if you pick up a copy of the New York Times, which is generally considered our nation's newspaper of record, we'll revisit that idea a little bit later. This motto is emblazoned on every masthead: all the news that's fit to print. But what does that really mean? Well, this guy, A.L. Simon Oakes, who was the publisher of the New York Times, established that slogan to set his paper apart from its more sensational competitors, all that yellow journalism from the 19th century and everything. And what he said was that he wanted a reportage that lived up to that promise of being all the news that's fit to print. So I think that that gives us some interesting things to consider here in higher ed when thinking about that promise. And one is, what is fit? Like, when we're talking about all the news that's fit to print, what does it mean to be fit? How do we determine what's fit and what's not? And the other question is, what promise is our news supposed to live up to? We talk about branding and our university brand and communicating our brand. So if a brand is a promise, which is not an original idea, but the sense that us communicating who we are and what we stand for, what we represent is part of our brand, then our news should live up to that, right? It should be the living manifestation, the daily events and goings on that tell us who we are and what we do, tell the world who we are, what we stand for. So what promise does our news live up to? Here's an example of a news story, which probably is similar to a lot of news stories for a lot of other institutions. This one just happens to be from Penn State. Professor Molinar receives Sells Award for Distinguished Multivariate Research. So we have sort of this paragraph here talking about his distinguished professor, and he did this thing, and here's a description of the thing, here's his background, and it kind of hits a formula. A lot of these sort of news stories and press releases that we might see. The one bit of the formula that's missing, I think, is the quote in the second graph from somebody, himself, someone else, talking about how important this is. Adds that human element to have that quote that we track down through 5 email threads, right? So what promise does this keep? I think it's in there somewhere. I think that the promise of, let's say, Penn State being a research institution or whatnot is in there, but is this the best way to communicate that? And to whom are we sharing this information and in this particular format? I think the important thing to realize is that news is not inherently valuable. Just because something happens doesn't mean it's as worthwhile as anything else. And it's important for us to put it through a filter of considering, is this news going to be meaningful to the audience receiving it? Is it going to enlighten or educate them in some way? And what does it do for us as an organization? Does it advance us? Does it help us communicate, do a better job of communicating that sense of who we are and what we do and what we stand for? It's really important for us to go through the process of addressing these questions before we publish news. Because if we're just turning out news, putting it through that funnel without going through that process, without intent, then we're really just taking a space with words and pixels. So it's incumbent upon us to be selective and purposeful in what we publish, because news, like all content, really needs to live at that tough sweet spot of institutional goals and user needs. And I imagine it's sort of like a Venn diagram, and the greater the overlap between the two, that's what we want to aim for. I think we should aim in all of our content, but specifically for news content, in having that overlap between that sweet spot, having that wider the more that we can. So who really cares about your news? Let's think about audience for a second. What are they looking for? What do they care about? What are they trying to do when they come to our website and they encounter our news content? So there was a study done by a UK firm named Headscape looking at analytics for a UK institution. And what they found is that on the homepage of this particular institution, fewer than 1% of visitors viewed a news release. And Chris Scott of this agency wrote that we can see by looking at landing pages for visits that include a news release that when a visitor lands on a news release page, it's typically a dead end, with most of those visitors leaving the site from that page. So when we are sort of peppering our home pages and our sites with news sidebars and news buckets and widgets and everything, because we desperately want people to understand who we are, what we do, what we stand for, are we just inviting them into a dead end? Are we sort of, building up this sense of, you're going to find something out, this is going to be worth it, and they get there and there's no next step, there's no compulsion to do something more, there's no change that's made in the mind and the heart, really, of that visitor. It ends up being a dead end. is that what we're really inviting people into here? Because this is what we're dealing with. Here's a search for pages on .edu websites with the words for immediate release. And you'll see out of these like 75,000 plus results, like there's so many of them. We're still doing this. And it's amazing to me because it's on the internet. It's already been immediately released. I don't know why we persist in doing this. It's sort of classic press release verbiage as if it just came across the teletype or something. But we do this because we always have, because this kind of change is really difficult for us to execute. And so these words live on sort of ghostly on web-based news content, press releases. Something else that the agency Headscape found was that news inhibits task completion. And Paul Boag, who runs a very popular resource for web news called Boag World, he said that users come away with questions and tasks. That's what they come to websites with. We either have something I need to do or a question I need answered. I'm not necessarily seeking news content. And news content often fails because, according to Boag, it can't help people answer those questions or do those tasks. It's too indirect. It doesn't really live up to the potential of its presentation that we give it. And at a certain point, all those widgets and sidebars are sort of just like advertisements. Their banner blindness takes hold. It's not enough, he said, for example, to write a press release saying how your organization has won an award. Instead, you really need to clearly explain how that benefits the user. So what does this mean to me? You're telling me the thing. The value of that is not implied. We need to do a better job of communicating the benefits of these things that happen. Yes, something happened, but what does it mean? What's the impact? What's the outcome of that? Okay, we're going to take a break from these sort of heady considerations and think about cats for a second, specifically cats on BuzzFeed. BuzzFeed is something that is also very ubiquitous. Love it or hate it, it's clogging our Facebook news feeds. It gets shared around. All these pages, these listicles, whatever you want to call them, are all over the place. And we may like it or not, but it's really, really successful. So what can we take away from the success of a site like BuzzFeed? And the founder, Jonah Peretti, says that we focus on publishing content our readers love so much, they think it is worth sharing. It sounds simple, but it's hard to do, and it's the metric that aligns our company with our readers. In the long term, it's good for readers and good for business. I think that's important. I talked before about thinking about that intersection between, what's good for us and what's good for them, and trying to sort of grow that. But you really want news to get people to feel something, to understand something. People should come away from news content changed in some way, having learned, having gained an appreciation for, understanding of, or compelled to take some sort of an action. It could be sharing it, could be looking to learn more about the institution, some sort of activity that makes the experience of having read that story worthwhile, because the value of news is not, again, that the thing happened. It's what the happening of that, what that thing that happened spurs next. It's what comes next. So news I consider to be the sort of the show, don't tell of our brand. All of our people, our knowledge, our activity, everything that we have going on as an institution should make people feel something and do something, and not get in the way of task completion, as Paul Boag warned against, but support it and provide some context for it. I love this quote. I've used this in presentations in the past. It's from a guy named Kyle Christie, who used to do PR at King's College in London. And he's no longer in higher ed, but I still bring this quote back out because it still remains true, and I think we still need to be reminded of it. Universities have an opportunity to leapfrog the mainstream media and explain our research, teaching, and wider contributions to society in forms beyond the text-based press release. We have websites and access to the tools needed to reach the public. So, I mean, this concept has come up before. This idea, let's own our story, right? Let's own that. But again, even if the act of ownership is not something that we can just implicitly understand, oh, this is what it means to own your story. What does that mean, and how can we meaningfully accomplish that? So, news needs content strategy. Shocking, I know. We spend a lot of time and resources on news content and working with our news offices, but we rely on it to do a lot of work for us. We're banking a lot on this work and spending a lot of time on it. So how do we know that it works? How can we ensure that it's communicating the right aspects of our brand, that it's reaching the desired audiences, that it's providing value, that it's supporting our broader institutional objectives? Um, Sometimes in a higher ed news office, there might be sort of old school perspectives that have taken hold, older ways of thinking from more of a newspaper perspective or a PR agency perspective. But we have to think of the fact that number one, we've got people reading this content who are trying to do things. How can we help them? We're part of an institution that's just trying to achieve certain things. How can we move that forward? And we're working in a climate and a medium that is ever changing. So how do we account for that while moving those other two pieces forward? It's a really tough balance to strike, but that's our task at hand, is to try to do that, try to make that work. So that is what we're going to talk about here today. So I would like to move on, and we're going to talk about a couple different things. I want to break this down into sort of three areas. These are actually not the three areas, but I would consider them to be project, process, and people. So we're going to start moving through this here. So first I want to look at the idea of criteria and establishing editorial criteria for our news content. Here's an example from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. This is their homepage. It looks like a pretty standard university homepage. You have a little admissions box, has some news and events here on the bottom right, has some academic links, and we have, of course, the ubiquitous carousel. Now, there's a lot to be said about carousels, good and bad, but here it's here. Let's just sort of accept it. But what's happening with this carousel? What's different that you might not realize at first blush is that this institution has actually created criteria for what goes into their homepage slides, which is kind of impressive. The featured item, for instance, must have interest or affect multiple university stakeholders and reinforce the university's core mission and messages of research, arts and culture, education, and community impact. That's great. It doesn't just say reinforce the core mission, but it reminds me of what that is. That's really impressive. But it goes on, and it also tells me what we will feature. So it gives me examples. What qualifies for meeting those standards? It could be obviously emergency notifications, major campus events like commencement, major athletic accomplishments, major campaign announcements or milestones like a 50th anniversary, major building openings, feature articles of students, alumni, and faculty. I have a really good sense now of what that means to have content that reinforces the university core mission messages. But I also have even further guidance on what we will not feature. Office moves. That makes me realize that, wow, at a certain point, there must have been enough requests to put my office move on the homepage that they had to write it into their criteria and say, office moves do not belong on the homepage slider, I'm very sorry to say. Recruitment events, calls for entry and participation, research studies, those kinds of things. So you have these editorial criteria established, hopefully, with buy-in from stakeholders that they're supported. So someone pushes and wants their office move on the homepage, everyone's committed to pointing to this and saying, no, these are the criteria, they're public, they're not hidden, they're not in my head, they're there for anyone to see and have a sense of what really belongs in that space. So social promotion for news content. Here is an example from NC State. They hosted Nate Silver, sort of the data superstar, famed from the various elections, predictions for who's going to win the presidential election and whatnot. And so he came to NC State and gave a talk. So that's pretty cool. So this is the story. NC State hosts Big Data's Big Star. But when you look at what they posted on Facebook about it, it's a little bit different. They have this summary that says, the key to success in hashtag big data fields, major in statistics, math, or economics, but study outside your field too. So said best-selling author Nate Silver, who spoke on campus last week. So, and what happens here at NC State, and I learned about this from talking to Tim Jones, who heads up the operation over there, is that the people who write the story, so the reporter who actually went to the event and covered it and wrote the news story, is also trained in writing a Facebook status. So knows best practices for length and format and style, and also I think important noting here is audience. we're talking about majors in statistics, math, or economics. I'm sure that Nate Silver talked about a lot of things about his methodology and his fame and whatever else he talked about, but this Facebook status is geared towards a student, a prospective student audience, because it's talking about how to succeed in big data by majoring in stats, math, or economics, but study outside your field too. So of all the information that was contained, that he got from this event contained in the story, the Facebook status, which this author was trained to write himself or herself, is geared towards the sort of student audience, talking about majors. And that's what they do at NC State, is that the person who's the expert on this story writes the social media post. I think that's good because it relieves the social media manager, who I'm sure would be capable of reading the story and coming up with a reasonable teaser for Facebook, but is not closest to the story, wasn't there at the event, doesn't have that sort of sense of being a sort of a temporary expert on it by virtue of having been there. The author of the story, who went to the event, does that, and it gets them invested in the promotion of their news via social media. It's not a separate operation. They're part of it. They're writing that tease. That's part of their charge as a news writer, and I think that is a really intriguing model to work with. So I work at Suffolk University, and in the fall we had a forum of candidates for Boston's mayoral race. And what was cool is that some of our government students got to ask questions on this. It was a televised event on regional cable network. It was very cool. So the news story for this event was headlined, "Students Question Mayoral Candidates on Issues Critical to Young and Old," which is accurate, but is not really compelling. But when promoting this on Facebook, our social media manager sort of pulled out the most interesting nugget from that event and said, "How a Suffolk student landed multiple internship offers on live television without even sitting for an interview." So that really pulled out the juiciest bit, created a whole lot of intrigue, find out how, and then a link to the news story. So I present this as sort of an alternative to the NC State model, where at this time it was the social media manager reappropriating the news article, news teaser, versus that being done from in-house, because I know that it might work in different ways for different institutions. But what was great about this is that this story, I think I would attribute it largely to the intrigue of this teaser, had so much more significant traffic, 4 times as much in other stories promoted through Facebook and other social media channels. And it created a lot of engagement. You could see even a comment from the student herself, who actually did end up getting an internship with the candidate who ended up winning the mayoral race. So there's a whole arc that developed from this moment. So in our news stories that we sort of recap events and whatnot, are we looking for those moments that can be those hooks for social promotion, for getting the word out about things? So University of Florida is a major research institution, and the research is really hard to communicate. A lot has been written about how it can be tough to really boil down the details of research into something that we can digest easily. But here's something that University of Florida did with some research into how using peanut butter and a ruler can help diagnose Alzheimer's disease. They created this graphic sort of size for Facebook sharing, with a big spoonful of peanut butter and a wooden ruler, and this again creating a sense of intrigue. And almost, you look at it, you're like in disbelief. You're like, wait, Alzheimer's? It's a really serious topic. Lots of intense research happening. What the heck does peanut butter and a ruler have to do? I got to click. I got it. What is this talking about? And I look at the text too. It's worded in a sort of lighter way. A way to test for Alzheimer's disease using peanut butter and a ruler. Really. So it acknowledges that sense of intrigue and disbelief. And you get to the article and you read it and you learn about how this is a diagnostic method that's been developed. And in talking to the former social media manager for the University of Florida, Bruce Floyd, I said, well, how popular was this post? And he said it was huge, one of the most popular posts ever on the University of Florida Facebook page. And this is a team that is major Division I football, so you got to imagine that's also a big social media draw for them. But this story about research was one of their biggest performers because infographics had been sort of new to them at that point. Actually, I shouldn't really call this an infographic. It's just really a graphic. We're sort of new to them at that point, and using it in this way with this kind of language to communicate research ended up being really, really, really effective in driving people to that news content. So content discovery, there's a lot of different things that we can do just by paying attention to communicate news. A large part of our news is already being written without us even thinking about it. Our community is out there creating content. So how can we utilize that to inform our news content? If we're paying attention to videos that are being posted to YouTube, for instance, we might discover an alum who gave a TED Talk and then go on to write a news story about that alum who turns out to be a co-founder of Warby Parker eyeglasses, an alum that had not necessarily been on your radar before. And that just came from paying attention to content published via social media, such as YouTube. Or if you cultivate a conversation on Facebook, can you then sort of consolidate that or bring the best of it into a news story that's relevant to something like moving in for the new semester? There's lots of ways that just by either social monitoring or through the conversations that we generate through social media, that we can use that to inform news content that it's not just different than sort of your standard 800-word profile or article, but it can also just create some really compelling, interesting content that we would not have had a way to create otherwise. So in thinking about editorial calendars, editorial calendars are great. I'm sure that we've talked a lot about them. I should hope that a lot of people are using them in some way. But I think what an interesting thing to consider with editorial calendars is how you don't just track the story subject and the date and when you published it, maybe where you published it. We can also sort of keep it, use editorial calendars to serve as sort of a branding archive. We're trying to reinforce our news against certain brand criteria or against certain audiences or representation of schools or themes. We can do that with our editorial calendar to reinforce our balance. So that, again, in this idea of creating purposeful news content, that we're holding ourselves to that. Which audience, which school does this represent, which experiential theme, which value, which attribute, however you've sort of divvied up your understanding of your brand, whatever it is you want to represent, build that into your calendar so that you maintain the balance that you want and that you need for your institution. So measurement, that's something that is just a little bit important to consider. If we're thinking about being purposeful, we have to have a plan for measurement to show the value of news content. Again, as I said at the beginning, the value of this content is not implied, it's not implicit. We have to measure it, we have to share that measurement and use that data to inform better content the next go around. And the foundation of that is really setting goals. What is it that we want news content to do? And figure out the best way to measure that. I mean, we're doing this with our web content that lives elsewhere on our website. We should be doing the same for our news content. And saying that we have to work for that value. We have to do work to understand that value. And then have that feedback loop so that we're making content that next go around. In developing our alumni magazine, which had not been online before, we thought through what are our goals, what are our objectives, and sort of went through this process. And if you look on the Meet Content Archives, you'll find information about this process and thinking about what are the goals, what are the KPIs, what are the targets, what are the segments, how do we track the things that we want the magazine to do. And that's something that we took into account in developing it. We had sort of a unique opportunity because it was from the ground up and had not existed digitally before, but something that we can grow from and create a dashboard where we're gauging the effectiveness of this content. Use that to inform the next issue and figure out how we want to promote things differently or contextualize things differently, et cetera. So it's been valuable to us in that respect. I always use this graphic of a cycle when I think about how you use measurement to inform content. And again, the same goes for news content. We're planning out our news editorial calendar. We're looking at the things that are happening. We're looking at what it is that we want to cover. We create content that aligns with that. We push it out there. We find ways to promote it through email newsletters, through social media, through other means. We measure the outcomes of that content. We analyze that information to try to understand what the data is telling us, and use that to inform the plan. And then the cycle continues anew. So taxonomy is one of my favorite nerdy things because it's sort of it's a backbone of a lot of what we do. Here's an example from Northeastern from their really pretty and delightful news site, which I enjoy a great deal. And they have a category that they post news content in. So this is campus and community. You can see at the top now, there's science and technology, business and economy, etc. And there's various tags, area, entrepreneurship events, the president's name, television, undergraduate students. So you might have different tags that represent different audiences, different key personalities, themes or programs like entrepreneurship, news topics such as events, television, etc. So, thinking about taxonomy, it's really the information that helps us do more with content. You can pull this and create feeds of relevant content. You can organize. You can give people, give your users ways to dig into other topics more easily, help people understand the context in which the news is published, and do more with it. Feed it across your website to appropriate pages, campus life pages, admissions pages, whatever makes sense. By creating this sort of digital infrastructure underneath your news content, you empower you empower yourself to do more with your news. The key to taxonomy, though, is number one, making sure it's consistent. So if I have entrepreneurship in this story, but entrepreneurs in another, I've split the stream, and those two stories are not, through that tag on that theme or program name are not going to be able to live together. So it can be tricky because of that, especially internally if you're trying to sort of get people invested in using these tags and training them and letting people know what they are, etc. But there's a lot that can be gained by building the digital infrastructure and then having the appropriate training and understanding of the value of a taxonomy. There's a lot that you can do with your news, both to sort of power your news site, but also your whole website, and do more with that, but also give your users more ways to explore content that's relevant to them. So taxonomy can do a lot for you in its nerdy and delightful ways. So the idea of landing pages. People, and this is not a new concept, but it's important to think about it in the news context as well, perhaps even more so, that people aren't going to come to our site necessarily through the front page, or to come to our news site through this news homepage, that we might want to carefully curate and have these lovely carousels and have all these lovely presentations, but chances are they're going to click on a news link in an email, or they're going to click on a news link through a tweet, or someone is going to send something to them, or they'll discover something via Google while searching for one thing or another. And that's their landing page. That's their homepage, that news article page. So it's so important that we put a lot of thought into that landing page, into that news page, because it functions as a landing page. So thinking about purposeful news content, well, what do we want people to do? What do we want people to do next? Where do we want them to go? What do we want them to understand? So have those calls to action clear and have a sense of what it is we want people to do next. Think back to that study from Headscape where news was a dead end. We don't want it to be a dead end. We have to tell people or give people a clear guide as to where they should go next, and give people those options so that the news, when they land on a news story, it's not the end of something, but it's the beginning of their journey of learning about who we are as an institution, or it doesn't inhibit their task completion, but it supports it in some way by providing them with those options that are relevant to them, but also beneficial to us in terms of calls to action. So put a lot of thought into your article page because it functions as a landing page as well. Here's one thing that is also important to think about in terms of landing pages is Google. Google search results can be a landing page. But one opportunity that you can miss is if we're not taking into consideration various lengths for headlines or for teasers in search results. So here's an example from Vanderbilt where we have some headlines that trail off with ellipses. We have some story summaries that trail off with ellipses. And if I'm trying to sort of know if I want to click on this story, it's a missed opportunity because there's potentially valuable information that Libya needs help building a ... and I don't know. So I don't have confidence from this result that that's going to be what I want to click on. So this it compels us to think more closely about titles and meta descriptions and other various SEO considerations for news if we want people to get from this search results screen to our news story and then journey on from there. So editorial planning, I feel, is such a hot topic. Depending on what kind of group you have, you're working with people in your unit, across the institution, younger, older, this group, that group. It can be really hard to find a meaningful way to wrangle information, story ideas, editorial calendars, roles, workflows, editorial workflows. The whole thing is really difficult. I think there's a huge need or a huge desire for some sort of magic bullet tool that's going to make that happen. There is no magic bullet tool, unfortunately. The magic bullet tool is the tool that works for you, and that could really vary depending on your group. It could be something like a project management tool like Basecamp or Asana or Trello. It could be an editorial management tool like Post or Divi. It could be something as simple as Google Docs. Actually, a lot of news organizations begin to use GitHub, which is a code repository that has mainly up till now been the domain of programmers and developers, but some editorial and communications folks are beginning to explore using GitHub for news project management, essentially. So there's a lot of options out there, but the only one that is going to work for you is the one that works for you. So it's important to remember that you can't try to force a tool down your team's throat. You have to think about what's best for your team, what the best tool is, and just hold people to it. No matter what the tool is, even if it's the perfect tool, usage might trail off, or people might sort of stop using it if there's not a reinforcement around it. So find some way to reinforce or incentivize usage of that tool, because if you don't, then the potential of the value of that information, of that workflow, of whatever it is that you're using it to accomplish will be lost or will be short-lived. Real-time news opportunity. I think there's a lot that we can gain from being more nimble news organizations in higher ed to sort of capitalize on the knowledge and the insight that we have to speak to current events in a very real and immediate way. This was a story from the Harvard Gazette from October 31st, 2013, that had a professor explaining the team chemistry of the World Series champion Boston Red Sox. They had gone from worst to first. It was the year of the marathon bombings. A lot happened, but they somehow won the World Series with this, scrappy, bearded group of goofy guys. This story came out the day after they won the World Series. So you have this sort of high of, oh my gosh, where's the first? It's so great. How did they do it? And here's Harvard explaining how they did it through this article. I'm sure I didn't, whip this up the night before. This wasn't like breaking news. But, they have this article that could, work really well for World Series one, but it would have worked well also for, even if they had lost, because they got to the World Series, they got to that point. And they have a faculty member explaining here, this is how they got this far. I have the academic knowledge to contextualize this event and help you understand it. So being able to use our news operations in that kind of way to sort of give context to current events can be really powerful. Looking at your news site as a content hub is important, because chances are that if you're at that sort of university-wide level, sort of that top-level Marcom office, you're not the only group that's creating content. You have the engineering newsletter, you have the political science blog, you have the alumni magazine, you have the medical school alumni magazine, you have a whole bunch of other different content types or content sources from across your institution. You might have media coverage, you have blogs, other things. I think it's important not to prejudice one type of content against another. It all has value. So if we're working to build internal awareness and community around people who are producing news, have that reflected in your site. And I think that the Johns Hopkins Hub does a great job of this, of curating content sources from across the institution and bringing them together into one place. And I don't really think that they prejudice the hub content versus other content. It's the best content. It's most relevant content is what gets featured, whether it's this video or some other study from the School of Public Health or whatever, what have you. It's really just about, let's bring all this together into one place to collect it, to give it more visibility, but also just give us more raw material to work with to convey the story of Johns Hopkins, which comes from a lot of different places. And there's a lot of different outlets for telling it. So I commend them for bringing this together. And if you haven't seen the hub from Johns Hopkins, I encourage you to check it out. It's a good time. So storytelling and content types. Going back to this guy, Dr. Molinar here, the idea of the press release, I think, is something that has been changing for a long time. And I love this perspective from Thomas Kellner, who works in content marketing for General Electric. In a great article last year, he said that the ultimate goal is to retire the press release. It's a great holder for facts, but you never want to read one. We want to tell stories. So what does it mean to tell stories? We talk about this a lot, and here's what I consider sort of the three top things that a story should do. It should convey relevance, it should evoke empathy, and it should spur action. I use this image of the bridge because I think that a story, number one, is a journey. It takes you from one place to another. You should emerge on the other side changed in some way, have some new understanding, some new appreciation for something, whatever the subject is. But also, narrative stories really are a bridge between you and your audience. It's a great way to communicate if you're using these abilities to get people to do something or to feel something or to have something matter to them, be relevant to them. And then going back to that sense of branding and story and news, stories should really just communicate who you are, quite simply. This is a great example from Mizzou, a story about a student named Shane who went through gender transition. And what's really gets me, what really impresses me about this is that we spend a lot of time, I think, in higher ed, or some institutions do, hand-wringing about diversity. How do we present diversity? What do we say about diversity? Let's have our diversity microsite. Let's have our diversity brochure. But here is the statement that you need to make about diversity. I mean, at Mizzou, it's just having an article about Shane and Shane's experience, what Shane has gone through, and that's it. That's your diversity statement for the day. And it means a lot more, arguably, than some sort of microsite or brochure because it's a person's story. They're a real student going through this. We're being honest about their experience. They're being honest about their experience and being a part of it. It says photos and video by Shane Epping. So I think that is really powerful way to consider in thinking about storytelling. How are we being honest about ourselves to communicate those key things? Using tools like Storify, pulling together other people's moments to tell a bigger story of something. So this is what we did at Suffolk with commencement. I'm sorry, not commencement, move-in for the freshman class in the fall. The way that we told that story was just by creating a Storify of pulling together their moments, their pictures, their anxieties. It rained, people were wearing raincoats, like all the moments, all the honesty of that experience through their images and through their words. And that made for a powerful way to tell that story versus just sort of a standard sort of write-up. Now, in Vanderbilt had a report come out that showed that they had an $8.6 billion positive impact on the state of Tennessee. Rather than just solely just put out that report, put out that news, they also used Storify again to pull together some of the tweets from people who are part of the Vanderbilt community, showing that they're proud of this accomplishment. So again, it's not just like, here's this news, here's this report that says how great we are. Here's our community saying how proud that positive impact that they make on the economy makes them feel. And it adds a whole new dimension to it that, yes, we may have this impact and we have this economic value to the state, but it's not just, we're not just talking about numbers and data. These are people. There are people who are doing that work and making that impact, and they're proud of that. They're proud to be part of this community. They're proud to, have this positive impact on their state. And these tweets, love being part of VU, I heart my job. That speaks to that in a way that other mediums would probably have a bigger challenge to do. But by just pulling these tweets together, it's their honest reactions to this report, which I think is really cool. Infographics are also a good way to convey news. Now, infographics are sometimes maligned, but I think that they have a real value when we're talking about trying to represent complex bits of data or information in a visual way to help people understand. So here's an example from UT Austin. Macomb School of Business had a gift, a $50 million gift, and they sort of broke it into this pie chart. It sort of looks like a sack of money held by this cowboy-looking guy who was the donor. And it's just an interesting way of breaking down the percentage for where does $50 million will be allocated. So I think that infographics sometimes get misused, but can be really valuable when we're looking to do something like represent numbers or data in a meaningful, easy to digest way. The power of video content, of course, can't be overlooked. But again, we can make a video of anything. What's worth making a video of? This is a good example I like from Tufts. George Elmore, a biology professor and a botanist, they did a video doing a tour of him walking around campus, exploring the edible greens on campus, so basically eating weeds. But if you watch the video, it shows which ones are edible. It has their scientific names, talks about how to prepare them, and there's a video of him like with a little hot plate, like in some crevice somewhere, cooking up some sort of weed that he picked off the ground. So it's weird, it's quirky, but it's also educational, and it also showcases a different side of campus that you normally wouldn't think about. So videos really to sort of tell all those things together is really the ideal format for that. Dogs are a great content type. I mean, photography, but also dogs always win. But sometimes all you need to tell a story is a really great photo, like a student hugging a puppy. What more could you want out of that? That's really just the winner right there. But a lot can be gained from combining content types as well. BU Today does this really well, very frequently. Here's an example of pulling together stunning photography, great video, and then a well-written story all together to sort of convey the sort of aerial dancing. So by combining these content types together purposefully, in a complementary way, they're really telling a powerful story about this. You might also consider something like Vine as a way to tell a story. University of Washington had 5 icons that helped them reach number 5 on Forbes' Most Beautiful Campuses list. So hopefully this video is coming across through the webinar, but they created a Vine showing those 5 spots. Oh, it only played once. Maybe I go back and it'll play again. There you go. And what's cool about using video in this way is that instead of just static photography, is that I can really experience it. I can hear the water. I can see the leaves rustling. I can, see someone walking across the quad. And if I'm an alum or a student, that gets me nostalgic, right? It's those famous iconic spots that make me remember what a beautiful campus UW has. And by having those little video snippets, it makes it more real than just a photograph can. Some other examples of vines from higher ed, Cornell, just showing a photo of some high school students in a high school summer program. Here's a great way, our band is going to be on Good Morning America. Let's do a story about it. Well, what is there to say except that they were on Good Morning America and they performed what they performed? Here's the vine that has the photographs and the fact that they were there, has the tags, it's all set. Bam. That's might be arguably the best way to convey that tidbit from Temple. So UW Oshkosh has a weekly news show that they produce. This is Alex Hummels from Oshkosh who produces it every week. It takes about an hour, he says, to produce this news show. And it highlights things that are happening on campus, and they play it on screens at various places on campus to sort of catch the passerby student to watch the broadcast. And according to Alex, the reason they started this was because Oshkosh, Wisconsin, was branding itself as the event city. And the university was like, hey, well, we're a huge part of that. We have tons of events. So let's create this weekly sort of recap or preview of the events that are happening on campus. Number one, to galvanize our internal community, to make them aware of what's happening. But number two, they were also working with the local newspaper to sort of share this video content with the broader community outside of campus to say, hey, come to our campus, be part of our events. We have these events that are open to you, and inviting the city and the town to invite people to come and come to their events. So this video feature, it's crazy to be a Google Hangout. The report lives on YouTube, But even though it lives on YouTube, it's not that the YouTube audience is the main audience for it. It's not like these get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hits, but it's more for repurposing via like a local newspaper's website or for display internally on campus through campus display screens. So that's an interesting way that they go about creating this broadcast with these different audiences and goals in mind. All right, so next thing that we're going to talk about here is people and how partnerships can really help us churn out effective news content. Org charts are hard. Org charts are really difficult. I think they can often be the enemies of effective communication. If you look at, here's an example from Georgia Tech. You have different communications types siloed from one another. You might have, here's campus communications, here's a photographer over here, here's media relations over here, social media over here. So if one person wants to talk to another person, the web developer wants to talk to the media relations person, or the photographer wants to talk to the internal communications manager, it may seem like you could just walk across the office and make it happen, and typically you can, but the way that organizations are structured in terms of reporting and collaboration, it can sometimes be really hard to get cool cross-departmental work done because of organizational structure. And that affects our online experiences. That affects the stories that we tell if we're not able to collaborate meaningfully across different skill sets, PR, web, social, etc. And it can also inhibit information sharing if the channels that we're reporting structure reflect, if we're not able to sort of overcome those to let the media relations rep know something really important that the internal communications manager knows, that maybe also the social media manager should know. How do those relationships survive against a structure that does not encourage them? It's really difficult and requires a great effort on our part to keep those relationships alive and sustainable. So obviously this is the goal. We want to try to break through those silos in some way. And it's incredibly hard to do, and it requires our persistence with keeping those goals in mind of communication and collaboration. It's on us to really just keep on selling the need for collaboration, to reach out and just try to erode as much as possible at those org charts by bringing people together, calling meetings from across different groups, taking a lead and owning that process, having coffee with as many people as possible, and trying to sort of build relationships, because it's only from relationships that interesting things are going to happen or that change is going to come. And relationships need to transcend organizational structure. So the more people you're having coffee or tea with outside of your group, the better, because you're going to know more and more interesting things could happen. And hopefully you're bringing those people back into your group and building those connections and widening them, because we all work for the same institution. So the more that we are aligned together, in spite of what our organizational structures might fit us into, the more equipped I think we'll be to work towards those goals in meaningful ways. But we might be working in sort of an older space. It's hard to keep up with this kind of innovation because the way our organizations are structured, our titles, our jobs, the roles that we have funds allocated for might be a legacy from 5, 10, 20 years ago. Is our personnel keeping pace with the pace of innovation for digital publishing? It can be really, really hard to be agile if we're trying to do so against these legacy structures and against these sort of older school processes. Are we structured to publish like a magazine when we're trying to function like a Twitter account? It can be really hard. So if we're trying to sort of evolve, but working within these sort of older structures, how do we do that? I think respect plays a huge key role in that, because you might be having people who come from different backgrounds who need to be pressed into, if not doing new kinds of work, but at least understanding new kinds of work. And it's not a matter of saying, well, your skills are useless, or your skills don't really mean anything right now. It's more a function of saying, you have valuable insight and valuable skills to bring to this. So let's find the best way to adapt those for this new context, right? It's always going to be a little bit like herding cats, of course, as always. But I think especially for people who work in a central news group, it's really a great opportunity to sort of bring people together. So, you know, editorial meetings get aligned very often, but I think that we can create some meaningful structures through these sort of editorial groups and discussions that can help reinforce information sharing, collaborative storytelling, and whatnot. So some ways I think that we can do that are make sure that those groups and those meetings are owned and facilitated. Someone has to be the leader. Someone has to make sure that it happens every week, every 2 weeks, and take a stake at it. So making sure that there's that sense of ownership that's reinforced over time so things keep happening. Share that measurement. We talked about measurement earlier. So if you have those measurements, share it. It's not a state secret to share the outcomes of what news gets put on the homepage or what news is posted on your news site. The more that becomes something that everyone can understand and appreciate and learn from, the more transparent you can be, I think that the more you can gain from it and get input from others as well. Source ideas from across campus. Get ideas from people even beyond just the editorial staff. Invite your athletic director, invite the head of dining services, invite different people to share what's happening in their group, what's happening in their area, so that you'll have a better sense of what's happening at the institution. Because that's the goal, right? Is to know if we know our place, then we can talk about our place. Make sure that it's not just writers and editors. Make sure it's also social media professionals, and make sure it's your photographer and your videographer and all those people who represent different ways of telling stories are in those meetings where you're going to discuss what those stories are. And make sure you're capturing everything that's said. A lot of conversation can fly back and forth, and some valuable tidbits can be lost if there's not someone who's accountable for capturing them and making sure that they're shared back with the group. And always, align these conversations against your editorial priorities. In the moment, we can often lose sight of what we're trying to do because other things come up or we get some crazy idea. But try whenever possible to always revisit those editorial priorities and make sure that your work is aligned with them. So going back to Adolph Oakes here for a second, I mentioned before that the New York Times, about 100 years ago, began being considered the national newspaper of record. And that wasn't just because they were so renowned or had such a high quality of reporting or whatnot. It was actually because the New York Times published an index of the subjects covered in its pages. They published a taxonomy. So to me, that's kind of cool that what we've come to understand as being a paper of record actually goes back to what I sort of called before as a delightfully nerdy practice. And to me, just goes to show that all the pieces and components of what makes news happen inside and out shape what that news means, what kind of influence and impact it has. And the same goes for us. I mean, our news that we put out there, that representation, the show don't tell of our brand, is the publication of record for our institution. So it's all the more reason that we need to be purposeful in our execution of it. So that is everything I had to say about creating purposeful news content. So I really thank you for your time. We might have time for a couple questions. It's about 1:57 here.